Okay, is this working? Just working, testing. Testing. Low volume. Is it fine? Enough or? Okay then. Alright. Sweet. Welcome to the Saturday night reading stream. I will, of course, tonight be reading The Jewish Question, a Marxist Interpretation, continuing where we left off last week, starting chapter 3, the period of the Jewish usurer. Let's just get right into it. Up to the 11th century, the economic regime reigning in Western Europe is characterized by the absence of commodity production. The few cities that survived from the Roman era primarily fulfill administrative and military functions. All production is destined solely for local consumption, and the self-sufficient seigneurial domains enter into contact with the wide world solely through Jewish merchants who venture into their lands. The commercial role played by Europeans could only be passive in character. But with time, and with the continuous growth in the importation of Oriental goods, there is an incentive to produce directly for exchange. The development of trade thus stimulates domestic production. The production of use values progressively gives way to the production of exchange values. Not all domestic products are desired by the Orient. The production of exchange values first develops in those places where a set of conditions exists for the manufacture or extraction of certain goods especially prized abroad, monopoly products. Such were the woolens of England, the textiles of Flanders, the salt of Venice, copperware from Dinant, Belgium, etc. In these favoured places rapidly develop those specialized industries, the products of which were at once spread beyond their place of origin. Trade advances from the passive to the active stage. Linen from Flanders and fabric from Florence leave to conquer the wide world. As they are much sought after, these products are at the same time the source of enormous profits. This rapid accumulation of wealth is the basis for an accelerated development of a native merchant class. Thus, salt became a potent weapon in the hands of the Venetians for attaining wealth and for holding peoples in subjection. From the very beginning, these islanders had made a salt in their lagoons that was much sought after by all the people living on the Adriatic, and brought Venice trading privileges, concessions, and advantageous treaties. So long as Europe lived under a regime of natural economy, the initiative in commercial traffic belonged to merchants from the Orient. principally the Jews. Only some peddlers, some lowly suppliers to the mansions of the nobles and the clergy, succeed in freeing themselves from the humble mass of serfs bound to the soil. But the development of domestic production makes possible the rapid formation of a powerful class of native merchants. Emerging from the artisans, they gain control over them by taking over the distribution of raw materials. Contrary to trade as conducted by the Jews, which is clearly separate from production, domestic trade is essentially based on industry. Give me a minute to just go grab some water. Oh, oh, okay. Everywhere, industrial development marches hand in hand with expansion of trade. Venice had the advantage of being simultaneously one of the greatest commercial cities of the world and one of the most industrial. Its fabrics were of immense service to its traders in their relations with the Orient. Sound is gone. Um, is it working again now? I just disconnected for a second there. Okay. Okay. I'll just restart that paragraph. Everywhere industrial development marches hand in hand with expansion of trade. Or with expansion of trade. Venice had the advantage of being simultaneously one of the greatest commercial cities of the world and one of the most industrial. Its fabrics were of immense service to its traders in their relations with the Orient. Venice and its neighboring cities were full of all kinds of factories. In Italy, as in Flanders, the maritime commerce and the inland commerce, which was its continuation, resulted in the activity of the seaports. Venice, Pisa, and Genoa in the south, Bruges in the north. Then, behind the seaports, the industrial cities developed. On the one hand, the Lombard communes and Florence. On the other, Ghent, Ypres and Lille, Douai and further inland, Valenciennes and Brussels. The woolen industry became the basis of the greatness and prosperity of the medieval cities. Cloth and fabric were the most important goods in the fairs of the Middle Ages. That shows the profound difference between medieval and modern capitalism. Modern capitalism is based on a tremendous revolution in the means of production. Medieval capitalism rested solely on the development of the production of exchange values. The evolution of exchange in the medieval economy proved fatal to the position of the Jews in trade. The Jewish merchant importing spices into Europe and exporting slaves is displaced by respectable Christian traders to whom urban industry supplies the principal products for their trading. This native commercial class collides violently with the Jews, occupants of an outmoded economic position inherited from a previous period in historical evolution. The growing contradiction between Christian and Jewish trade therefore leads to the opposition of two regimes, that of exchange economy as against natural economy. It was consequently the economic development of the West that destroyed the commercial function of the Jews based on a backward state of production. The commercial monopoly of the Jews declined in the degree that the peoples whose exploitation had fed it developed. For a number of centuries, the Jews remained the commercial guardians of the young nations, to the advantage of the latter, and not without open recognition of this advantage. But every guardianship becomes burdensome when it outlasts the coming of age of its ward. Entire nations emancipate themselves from the tutelage of other nations, and not without a struggle. With the development of exchange economy in Europe, the growth of cities, and of industry based on guilds, the Jews are progressively eliminated from the economic position they had occupied. This eviction is accompanied by a ferocious struggle of the native commercial class against the Jews. The Crusades, which were also an expression of the will of the city merchants to carve a road to the Orient, furnished them with the occasion for violent persecutions and bloody massacres of the Jews. From this period on, the situation of the Jews in the cities of Western Europe is definitely compromised. In the beginning, the economic transformation reaches only certain important urban centers. The signatorial domains are very little affected by this change, and the feudal system continues to flourish there. Consequently, the prospect for Jewish wealth still exists. The signatorial domains still offer an important field of action to the Jews. But now Jewish capital, primarily commercial in the preceding period, becomes almost exclusively usurious or usurious. It is no longer the Jew who supplies the Lord with Oriental goods, but for a certain time it is still he who lends him money for his expenses. If during the preceding period Jew was synonymous with merchant, it now begins increasingly to be identified with usurer. Most historians claim that the Jews began to engage in lending only after their elimination from trade. But it is self-evident that this is a vulgar error. Usurious capital is the brother of commercial capital. In the countries of Eastern Europe, where the Jews were not evicted from commerce, we encounter, as we shall see later, a considerable number of Jewish usurers. In reality, the eviction of the Jews from commerce had as a consequence their entrenchment in one of the professions they had already practiced previously. The fact that Jews at different periods may have held landed property cannot serve as a serious argument in favor of the traditional thesis of Jewish historians. Far from constituting a proof of the multiplicity of the occupations of the Jews, Jewish property must be considered as the fruit of their usurious and commercial operations. In the business records of the French Jew Heliot of Franche-Comté, who lived at the beginning of the 14th century, we find vineyards mentioned among his properties. But what clearly emerges from these records is that the vineyards did not constitute the basis of an agricultural occupation for Heliot, but were the result of his merchant operations. When, in 1360, the King of France had again invited the Jews into his territory, the representative of the Jews, a certain Manasseh, raised the question of royal protection for the vineyards and cattle that would pass into the hands of the Jews as collateral for unpaid loans. In Spain, in the time of great theological disputes between Jews and Christians, the latter blamed the Jews for having become wealthy as a result of their usurious operations. They have taken possession of fields and of cattle. They own 3/4 of the fields and lands of Spain. The passage of property of the nobility into the hands of the Jews was a common phenomenon in this epoch. In Bohemia, for example, the village of Strizov, which had belonged to two nobles, was assigned to the Jews Fata and Merklin in payment of debts, 1382. The village Zlomany, Ujezd in Moravia, was allotted to the Jew Aaron D. Haradik. The village Neverovo in Lithuania was assigned to the Jew Levon Salomik, etc. So long as the Jews treated landed property solely as an object of speculation, it could only have an extremely precarious character. In fact, the feudal class very early succeeded in imposing a ban on Jews accepting landed property as collateral for loans. It was altogether different wherever a genuine economic and social change took place. In those places where the Jews abandoned business in order to become real landowners, sooner or later, they also had to change their religion. At the beginning of the 15th century, when a Jew named Walczko became the proprietor of several villages, the King of Poland exerted every effort to lead him to acknowledge his blindness and to enter the holy Christian religion. This fact is significant, for the kings of Poland carefully protected the Jewish religion. They would never have thought of converting Jewish merchants or bankers to Christianity, but a Jewish landowner in the Middle Ages could only be an anomaly. This is equally true as regards the Christian usurer. This problem naturally has nothing in common with nonsense about racial peculiarities. Clearly, it is foolish to claim, as Sombart does, that usury constitutes a specific trait of the Jewish race. Usury, which as we have seen plays an important role in pre-capitalist societies, is almost as old as humanity and has been practiced by all races and nations. It is enough to recall the leading role played by usury in Greek and Roman societies. But to pose the question in this way means to turn things upside down. It is not the innate capacities or the ideology of a social group that explain its economic position. On the contrary, it is its economic position that explains its capacity and its ideology. Medieval society is not divided into lords and serfs because each of these groups originally possessed specific qualifications for the economic role it was to play. The ideology and capacities of each class formed gradually as a function of its economic position. The same is true of the Jews. It is not their innate predisposition for commerce that explains their economic position, but it is their economic position that explains their predisposition to commerce. Well, I mean, that is something important to consider. Some people say, oh, they've um, they have like all of this, like they like usury, they like money, and it's like like the economic position serves as the basis of that. The economic position is not the result; it is the cause. So the Jews, moreover, are a very heterogeneous racial conglomeration. In the course of their history, they have absorbed a multitude of non-Semitic ethnic elements. In England, the monopoly of usury brought them such wealth that some Christians undoubtedly went over to Judaism in order to participate in the Jewish monopoly in lending. Judaism, therefore, is the product of a social selection, not of a race having an innate predisposition for commerce. But the primacy of the economic and social factor does not exclude, far from it, the influence of the psychological factor. It, just as it is infantile to see the economic position of Judaism as the result of the predispositions of the Jews, it is childish to consider it as the fruit of persecutions and of legal bans against exercising other professions than commerce or usury. In numerous writings on the economic life of the Jews in the Middle Ages, writes Heinrich Kuhnau, it is stated that they were excluded from the very beginning from artisanry, from traffic in goods, and that they were prohibited from possessing land property. That is only a fable. In fact, in the 12th century and in the 13th century, living in practically all of the great cities of Western Germany, they dwelt among the Christians and enjoyed the same civil rights as the latter. In Cologne, during an entire period, the Jews even possessed the right to compel a Christian who had a claim to make against a Jew to appear before Jewish judges in order to have the matter adjudged according to Hebraic law. It is just as false to assert that the Jews could not be admitted into the artisan guilds. True, several guilds did not admit what were termed Jewish children as apprentices, but this was not the case for all the guilds. The existence of Jewish goldsmiths and silversmiths, even in the period when the guild rules became far more severe, is sufficient proof of this. There were certainly few Jewish blacksmiths and carpenters among the artisans of the Middle Ages, but Jewish parents who sent their children into apprenticeship in these trades were very rare. Even the guilds that excluded the Jews did not do so out of religious animosity or racial hatred, but because the trades of usury and peddling were reputedly dishonest. The guilds excluded the children of Jewish business people engaged in usury or peddling in the same way that they did not accept the sons of simple labourers, carters and boatmen, and weavers of linen into their ranks. Feudal society was essentially a caste society. It desired that everyone remain in his place. It fought usury by Christians just as it made it impossible for the bourgeois to attain nobility, and just as it disdained the noble who lowered himself to the practice of a trade or to engaging in business. In 1462, the Dr. Hahn Winter was driven from the city of Nordlingen because he practiced usury through the intermediary of a Jew. 30 years later, in the same city, a bourgeois named Kinkel was placed in the pillory and driven from the city for having practiced the Jewish profession. The Synod of Bamberg in 1491 threatened to drive every Christian practicing usury, either by himself or through the intermediary of Jews, out of the Christian community. In 1487, in Silesia, it was decreed that every Christian practicing usury would be placed in the hands of the royal tribunal and punished in exemplary fashion. So long as the feudal structure remains solid, the attitude of Christian society toward loans at interest does not change. But the deep-seated economic changes that we have examined previously transform the conditions of the problem. Industrial and commercial development elevate banking to an indispensable role in economy. The banker advancing funds to the merchant or the artisan becomes an essential element in economic development. The treasury of the usurer in the feudal era fulfills the role of a necessary but absolutely unproductive reserve. Two of the forms in which usurer's capital exists in phases prior to the capitalist mode of production are particularly characteristic. The same forms recur on the basis of capitalist production, though here they are merely subordinate forms. In the latter case, they are no longer forms that determine the character of interest-bearing capital. These two forms are, firstly, usury by lending money to extravagant magnates, essentially to landed proprietors. Secondly, usury by lending money to small producers who possess their own conditions of labor, including artisans, but particularly and especially peasants, since wherever pre-capitalist conditions permit small autonomous individual producers, the peasant class must form their great majority. The usurer makes loans to the feudal lords and to the kings for their luxuries and their war expenditures. He lends to the peasants and the artisans in order to allow them to pay their taxes, rents, etc. The money lent by the usurer does not create surplus value. It merely allows him to take possession of a portion of the surplus product that already exists. The function of the banker is altogether different. He contributes directly to the production of surplus value. He is productive. The banker finances great commercial and industrial ventures, whereas credit is essentially consumer credit in the feudal era. It becomes credit of production and of circulation in the era of commercial and industrial development. There is consequently a fundamental difference between the usurer and the banker. The first is the credit organ in the feudal era, whereas the second is the credit organ in the era of exchange economy. Ignoring this fundamental distinction leads almost all historians into error. They see no difference between the banker of antiquity, the Jewish banker of England of the 11th century, and Rothschild or even Fugger. Newman says that the banker is respected while the usurer is hated and despised because the former lends to the rich and the latter to the poor. He overlooks the fact that a difference between two social modes of production and the social arrangements corresponding to them is involved here, and the question cannot just be resolved into the contrast between rich and poor. Of course, this distinction becomes really obvious in the capitalist epoch, properly so called, but even in the earlier forms, the money lender confronts him, the merchant, in precisely the same way as he does the modern capitalist. This specific relationship was even perceived by the Catholic universities. The universities of Alcala, of Salamanca, Ingolstadt, Freiburg im Breisgau, Mainz, Cologne, and Trier successively acknowledged the legality of interest on commercial loans. To the degree that economic development continues, the bank conquers ever more solid positions while the Jewish usurer increasingly loses ground. He is no longer to be found in the prosperous commercial cities of Flanders, because the Jews, unlike the Lombards, were concerned only with lending money at interest and did not play the role of intermediaries in commercial operations. After their elimination from commerce, a process accomplished in Western Europe in the 13th century, the Jews continued to develop the business of usury in regions not yet reached by exchange economy. In England, in the period of King Henry II, second half of the 12th century, they are already involved up to the hilt in usury. They are generally very rich, and their clientele is composed of the great landed proprietors. The most famous of these Jewish bankers was a certain Aaron of Lincoln, very active at the end of the 12th century. King Henry II alone owed him £100,000, a sum equal to the annual budget of the Kingdom of England at this time. Thanks to the extremely high rate of interest, it fluctuated between 43 and 86%, a large number of estates of the nobility had passed into the hands of the Jewish usurers. But they had powerful associates and demanding ones. If the kings of England supported the business of the Jews, it was because it constituted a very important source of revenue for them. All loans made with Jews were registered in the Scaccarium Judaeorum, exchequer of the Jews, and were assessed a tax of 10% for the royal treasury. But this legal contribution was far from sufficient for the kings. Any pretext was good enough for robbing the Jews, and the income from their usury continually contributed to enlarging the royal treasury. It was particularly bad for the Jews to have the kings as important debtors. The heirs of rich banker Aaron of Lincoln found this out in 1187 when the King of England confiscated his property. The dispossessed nobility would avenge itself by organizing massacres of the Jews. In 1189, Jews were massacred in London, Lincoln, and Stafford. A year later, the nobility, led by a certain Richard Malabis, destroyed the Scaccarium Judaeorum of York. The loan notes were solemnly burned. The Jews, besieged in a manner, committed suicide. But the king continued to protect the Jews even after their death. He demanded payment to himself of the sums due the Jews, by virtue of the fact that the Jews were the slaves of his treasury. Special employees were ordered by him to make an exact list of all the debts. At the beginning of the 13th century, the king granted a Magna Carta to the nobility, which brought certain improvements in the sphere of loans. Nevertheless, in 1262 and in 1264, new riots broke out against the Jews. In 1290, the entire Jewish population of England, that is to say almost 3,000 people, was expelled and its property confiscated. The economic situation of the Jews in France, where they were far more numerous, 100,000, was not perceptibly different from that of the Jews in England. With the accession of Philip Augustus, 1180, and in the first years of his reign, the Hebrews were rich and numerous in France. Learned rabbis had been attracted to the synagogue of Paris, which, on the solemn entry of Pope Innocent in St. Denis in 1135, had already figured among the established institutions of the capital at the time of the pontiff's visit. According to the historian Rigaud, they had acquired almost half of Paris. They, the Jews, had lent money throughout villages, cities, and suburbs, everywhere. A great number of Christians had even been expropriated by the Jews because of debts. It is mainly in northern France the Jews were engaged in usury. In Provence, in the south, during the 13th century, Jewish participation in trade was still very important. The Jews of Marseille were in regular business relations with Spain, North Africa, Sicily, and Palestine. They even owned ships, and like their ancestors of the Carolingian epoch, they imported spices, slaves, etc. But these are only vestiges from a previous period. Usury appears to have been the principal economic function of the Jews of France in the 13th century. A notary was appointed in each city for dealings in loans. The interest rate reached as high as 43%, up to the Statute of Melun 1230, which prohibited Jews from making loans on real property. The principal clients of the Jewish bankers were the princes and lords. At the beginning of the 12th century, the Jew Salomon of Dijon was the creditor of the greatest cloisters in France. The Count of Montpellier owed a Jew by the name of Bendet the sum of 50,000 sous. Pope Innocent III, in a letter to the King of France, expresses indignation at the fact that the Jews are taking possession of church property. They are seizing lands and vineyards. While the economic position of the Jews in France is similar to that of the Jews of England, their political situation is different. Political power, which was far more divided than in England, placed them in the hands of a multitude of princes and lords. The Jews were subjected to a host of levies and taxes that enriched the powerful. Various means were utilized in order to extract the maximum of money from the Jews. Mass arrests, ritual trials, expulsions, all of these were used as pretexts for enormous financial extortions. The kings of France expelled and admitted the Jews a number of times in order to seize their property. The social and economic position of the Jews in Muslim Spain is not known with accuracy. There is, however, not the shadow of a doubt that they belonged to the privileged classes of the population. Arriving in Granada, writes a certain Abu Ishaq of Elvira, died circa 1067, I saw that the Jews here occupy leading positions. They have divided up the capital and the province. The accursed ones are everywhere, or these accursed ones are everywhere at the head of the administration. They are engaged in the collection of taxes and live in luxury, while you Muslims are clad in rags. In Christian Spain, in Castile, the Jews are bankers, tax farmers, collectors, suppliers to the king. Royalty protects them as its economic and political supporters. The interest rate, lower than in other countries, was 33.3% at the beginning of the 12th century. In a great many cortes, advisory councils of feudal lords, the nobility has struggled for a reduction in the rate of interest, but has always met with the resistance of the kings. It was solely in the reign of Alfonso IX, 1188 to 1230, that the nobility achieved some concrete results in this sphere. A similar situation arose in Aragon. Judah de la Cavalleria is a characteristic example of a great Jewish capitalist of the 13th century. He leased salt mines, coined money, supplied the army, and possessed great estates and great herds of cattle. It was his fortune that made possible the construction of a battle fleet for the war against the Arabs. The economic backwardness of Spain made it possible for the Jews to preserve their commercial positions longer than in England or in France. Documents of the 12th century mention Jews of Barcelona who made voyages as far as the Bosphorus. In 1105, Count Bernard III granted a monopoly in the importation of Sicilian slaves to 3 Jews, merchants and shipowners in Barcelona. We must await the 14th century, when Barcelona, according to Perrin, will be transformed into an enormous store and workshop before the Jews are completely expelled from trade there. The situation declined to such an extent that they were compelled to pay a toll in order to pass through the city. The unfortunate Israelites, far from being merchants in Barcelona, entered it like merchandise. Jewish usury took on such dimensions in Aragon that serious movements against the Jews arose among the nobility and the bourgeoisie. In Germany, the primarily commercial period extends up to the middle of the 13th century. The Jews bring Germany into relations with Hungary, Italy, Greece, and Bulgaria. The slave trade flourishes up to the 12th century. Thus, we are reminded in the custom house records of Waldenstadt and of Koblenz that Jewish slave merchants had to pay a tariff of 4 dinars for each slave. A document of 1213 says of the Jews and Jews of Laubach that they are extraordinarily wealthy and that they conduct a great trade with the Phoenicians, the Hungarians, and the Croats. From the 13th century on, the importance of the German cities rose. As everywhere else, and for the same reasons, the Jews are eliminated from commerce and turn toward the banking business. The center of gravity of Jewish usury is concentrated in the nobility. The records of Nuremberg show the average debt contracted with the Jews rose to 282 gulden among the city people and 1,672 among the nobles. The same is true of the 87 lending notes of Ulm belonging to Jewish banking houses. Of the 17,302 gulden that they covered, 90% belonged to noble debtors. In 1344, the Jewish banker Pfeiflin sent the Count of Zweibrücken £1,090. The same Pfeiflin, in collaboration with a certain Jacob Daniels, lent 61,000 florins to the King of England, Edward III, in 1339. In 1451, Emperor Frederick III asked Pope Nicholas V for a privilege in behalf of the Jews, so that they could live in Austria and there make loans at interest to the great convenience of the nobility. In the 13th century, in Vienna, the Jews Lublin and Neckarlo are engaged in the important functions of finance administrators of the Austrian Duke. Comites Camerae Ducis Austriae. But this state of affairs could not continue indefinitely. Usury slowly destroyed the feudal regime, ruined all classes of the population, without introducing a new economy in place of the old. In contrast to capital, usury is essentially conservative. Usury, just like trade, exploits a given mode of production, but does not create it. Both relate to the mode of production from outside. Usury seeks indirectly to maintain this mode of production, so as constantly to exploit it anew. Where the means of production are fragmented, usury centralizes monetary wealth. It does not change the mode of production, but clings onto it like a parasite and impoverishes it. It sucks it dry, emasculates it, and forces reproduction to proceed under ever more pitiable conditions. Usurer's capital has capital's mode of production or mode of exploitation without its mode of production. Despite this destructive effect, usury remains indispensable in backward economic systems. But there it becomes an important cause of economic stagnation, as can be seen in many Asiatic countries. If the burden of the usurer becomes more and more unbearable in Western Europe, it is because it is incompatible with the new economic forms. Exchange economy penetrates rural life. Industrial and commercial development of the cities deals a blow to the old feudal system in the countryside. A vast market opens up to agricultural products, which leads to a decided retreat in the old forms of servitude and of rents based on the natural economy. Hardly anywhere, save in regions that were difficult of access or very remote from the great commercial movements, did serfdom retain its primitive form. Everywhere else, if it did not actually disappear, it was at least mitigated. One may say that from the beginning of the 13th century, the rural population in Western and Central Europe had become, or was in process of becoming, a population of free peasants. Everywhere in Western Europe, and in part in Central Europe, the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries are the epoch of the development of Jewish usury. But economic evolution brings about its rapid decline. The definitive expulsion of the Jews takes place at the end of the 13th century in England, at the end of the 14th century in France, at the end of the 15th century in Spain. These dates reflect the difference in the pace of economic development within these countries. The 13th century is an epoch of economic flowering in England, For Spain, it is the 15th century that is the high point of the process in which the Spanish kingdoms developed their commerce and added to their wealth. Sheep began to cover the countryside, and in the trade the north of Europe, Spanish began to compete with English wool. The exports of wool to the Low Countries were considerably increased, and sheep farming began to give Castile its characteristic aspect and to enrich the nobility. There was also an increasing trade with the north in iron from Bilbao, olive oil, oranges, and pomegranates. Feudalism gradually gives way to a regime of exchange. As a consequence, the field of activity of Jewish usury is constantly contracting. It becomes more and more unbearable because it is less and less necessary. The more money becomes abundant as a result of the more intensive circulation of goods, the more pitiless becomes the struggle against an economic function that could hardly find economic justification except in a time of economic immobility, when the treasury of the usurer was an indispensable reserve for society. Now the peasant begins to sell his products and to pay his lord in money. The nobility, in order to satisfy its growing luxury requirement, is interested in freeing the peasantry and in everywhere replacing fixed rent in kind by rent in money. The transformation of rent in kind into money rent that takes place at first sporadically, then on a more or less national scale, presupposes an already more significant development of trade, urban industry, commodity production in general, and therefore monetary circulation. The transformation of all classes of society into producers of exchange values, into owners of money, raises them unanimously against Jewish usury, whose archaic character emphasizes its transparent plunder. The struggle against the Jews takes on increasingly violent forms. Royalty, traditional protector of the Jews, has to yield to the repeated demands of congresses of the nobility and the bourgeoisie. Besides, the monarchs themselves are increasingly compelled to dig into the treasuries of the bourgeoisie, a class that soon monopolizes the most important portion of landed property. In the eyes of the kings, the Jews, as a source of revenue, become less interesting, leaving aside the fact that expulsion of the Jews was always an extremely profitable operation. It is in this fashion the Jews were increasingly expelled from all the Western countries. It was an exodus from the more developed countries to the more uh, backward ones of Eastern Europe. Poland, deeply mired in feudal chaos, became the principal refuge of Jews driven out of every place else. In other countries, in Germany, in Italy, the Jews still survived in the less developed regions. At the time of the travels of Benjamin of Tudela, 1166 to 71, there were practically no Jews in commercial centers such as Pisa, Amalfi, Genoa. On the other hand, they were very numerous in the most backward parts of Italy. Even in the Papal States, conditions were far superior for Jewish trade and banking than in the rich mercantile republics of Venice, Genoa, and Florence. The commodity economy therefore expelled the Jews from their last strongholds. The Jew, banker to the nobility, was already completely unknown in Western Europe toward the end of the Middle Ages. Here and there, small Jewish communities succeeded in maintaining themselves in certain secondary economic functions. The Jewish banks were no longer anything but pawnshops, where it is poverty that is the borrower. The collapse was a total one. The Jew became a petty usurer who lends to the poor of town and country against collateral of petty value. And what can he do with the collateral that is not redeemed? He must sell it. The Jew became a petty peddler, a dealer in second-hand goods. Gone forever was his former splendor. Now begins the era of the ghettos and of the worst persecutions and humiliations. The picture of these unfortunates bearing the badge of the wheel, a cloth badge Jews were forced to sew on their clothes, and ridiculous costumes, paying fees like beasts for passing through cities and across bridges, disgraced and rejected, has been implanted for a long time in the memory of the populations of Western and Central Europe. So, relations of the Jews with other classes in society. The evolution of the social and economic situation of the Jews was a determining influence upon the relations between them and other social classes. In the era of their high point economically, they are solicitously protected by kings and nobles. Their relations with the peasants are not of great importance. As against this, the relations of the Jews with the bourgeois class were hostile from the latter's very entry upon the historic scene. Eliminated from commerce, Jewish capital takes refuge solely in usury. This new situation brings about a change in the attitude of the nobility and royalty toward the Jews. The lords, finding themselves obliged to defend their threatened properties, often pass over to a pitiless struggle against the usurers who are ruining them. The kings continue to protect the Jews, but in reality they make use of the Jews to siphon off the resources of the country for their own profit. But so long as exchange economy has not yet penetrated into the rural sphere, the situation of the Jews still remains relatively tolerable. It is only when the countryside begins to be capitalized, when lords and peasants begin to produce more and more for the market, when money begins to conquer an increasingly wider field of action, that all classes in society find themselves in accord in persecuting and expelling the Jews. The victory of an economy based on money is also the defeat of the former moneyman. Eliminated from their role as bankers to the nobility, some Jews still succeed in hanging on within pores of the economy, becoming pawnbrokers, old clothes merchants, peddlers, and second-hand dealers. They eke out a miserable existence in dark ghettos, but of the hatred and disdain of the people. Increasingly, the Jews come into contact only with the poor, the artisans, and the peasants. And often the anger of the people, despoiled by the kings and the lords, and compelled to pledge their last belongings to the Jews, turns against the walls of the ghetto. The lords and rich bourgeois who utilize the Jews in order to further exploit the people often take advantage of these riots to pillage the slaves of their treasury. A. The royalty and the Jews. When the enemy of the Jews, Gonzalo Martinez, offered the King of Castile 3,000,000 pieces of gold on condition that he would expel the Jews, Archbishop Gil de Albornoz replied to him, "The Jews are a treasure to the king, a veritable treasure, and you want to drive them out? You are then no less an enemy of the king than you are of the Jews." Again, in 1307, Following upon a resolution of the Castilian priests against Jewish usury, the king prohibits raising any difficulties for the Jews. The Jews, states a decree on this subject, belong to the king to whom they pay taxes, and that is why it is impossible to permit any limitation whatever on their economic life, because this would be prejudicial to the royal treasury. In Poland, royal protection took on unusual proportions in this epoch. Thus, in 1504, the Polish king, Alexander, declares that he acts towards the Jews as befits kings and the mighty, who should not distinguish themselves solely by their tolerance to Christians, but also to the followers of other religions. Another Polish monarch, King Casimir Jagiello, similarly states that he acts in accordance with the principle of tolerance imposed by divine law. The reason for this attitude is not difficult to understand. The Jews were a source of considerable revenue for the kings. For example, in Spain, it was Jewish financiers, the Ravia brothers, who made it possible for the Castilian kings to bring the war against the Moors to a successful conclusion. Other Jewish bankers supported the Spanish kings in their struggle against the nobility. A special fiscal organization constituted for the collection of Jewish taxes functioned in several countries. In England, the Scaccarium Judaeorum permitted the registration of all Jewish business affairs and served as the intermediary for the recovery of loans. It was directed by a committee of 7 members, 3 of whom were Jews, 2 Christians, and 2 appointees of the king. Each credit operation brought in 10% to the royal treasury. It goes without saying that royalty could not remain content with such a meagre share. So, appropriate measures, such as extraordinary confiscations, made up for the deficiency in normal taxes. In legal terms, the Jews were slaves of the royal treasury, and in countries where political power was extremely divided up, they were slaves of the treasuries of the lords. Filling the cash boxes of the mighty became their reason for existing. In Anglo-Saxon law it is stated, ipsi Judei et omnia sua regis sunt. That is to say, the Jews and all their property belong to the king. The law of northern Spain is expressed in the same way. The Jews are slaves of the king and belong forever to the royal treasury. The system was one of great simplicity. The Jews despoiled the lords, and the kings fleeced the Jews. But in order to fleece them, it was essential to keep them there. That is why the kings protected the Jews and encouraged their ventures with all the means in their royal power. But while the king, in his capacity as representative of the state, was interested in protecting the Jews, we must not forget that he was, at the same time, a great lord and consequently one of their greatest debtors. In this role, he was obviously tempted to put an end to their undertakings, which was always a profitable operation. Whereas, on the part of the lords of lesser importance, the will to free themselves from their debts and to satisfy their greed was checked or restrained precisely by the protection that royalty accorded the Jews. The great King Lord himself obviously had no such external barriers to surmount. Two souls therefore inhabited his body. In his role as king, he fought the demands of nobility and the bourgeoisie and opposed the massacres and expulsions of the Jews. In his role as the greatest landed proprietor, he himself had the greatest interest in the persecutions directed against the Jews. The means the kings could use to extract money from their Jewish slaves were quite varied. First, there was the mass arrest. The Jews were imprisoned under any pretext and were not liberated until they handed over rather large sums of money. By this method, in 1180, the King Philip II of France extorted 15,000 marks from the Jews. Count Alphonse of Poitiers, on a similar occasion, collected £20,000. Still other methods were available. The Jews were accused of poisoning wells and using the blood of Christians in their religious ceremonies, ritual trials. In 1321, the Jews of France were fined £150,000 for poisoning wells. Finally, the most successful operation of this kind consisted of expelling the Jews, confiscating their goods, and later readmitting them in consideration of the payment of enormous sums. In 1182, Philip II throws all the Jews out of his kingdom and confiscates all their landed property. He lets them return 15 years later and receives a gift of 150,000 marks for this act of charity. Again, in 1268, King Louis IX of France decrees that all Jews must leave the country and their treasuries are to be confiscated. Soon after, negotiations are begun with his Servie Camere, and the order is subsequently rescinded in consideration of substantial gifts. The expulsion of the Jews in 1306 brings the King of France £228,460, an enormous sum for this period. Invited anew to return in 1315, the Jews paid £22,500 for this new favour. But some 6 years later, they find themselves compelled again to take the path of exile. The history of the Jews in France and of Languedoc, southern France, ends in 1394 by their definitive expulsion, accompanied by the usual sequel, confiscation of all their goods. These proceedings are not limited to France. In 1379, the Austrian princes imprisoned all the Jews found in their territories. The latter succeeded in getting free only at an enormous price. The same princes profited from anti-Jewish agitation among the peasants in 1387 by making the Jews pay 16,000 marks. The attitude of the kings and princes toward the Jews therefore seems somewhat contradictory. But it is determined in the last analysis by economic development. Wherever the Jews play an indispensable role in economic life, wherever exchange economy is only weakly developed, state interests impel the kings to protect the Jews, to defend them against all their enemies. Thus, in Poland, royalty always appears as their firmest protector. In the more developed countries, where usury is no longer anything but an anachronism, the kings have far fewer scruples about pillaging the Jews. Soon, the sole important financial power will be that of the bourgeoisie, basing itself on the development of the economy, and in the eyes of the king, the Jews will lose all interest. What are the Jewish bankers compared to financiers like the Fuggers, the Medicis? Here is what Schipper says in regard to the importance of the Jewish bankers. As regards the importance of the capital of the Jewish bankers of Italy, we have only found two really rich families among the Jewish capitalists. But what were they in comparison with such magnates as the Medicis, who, around 1440, had 500,000 florins, or Agostino Chigi, who in 1520 left 800,000 ducats? Jewish bankers had at their disposal only several thousand florins. It goes without saying that under these conditions the Jews could no longer be of interest to the kings. The era of the great Jewish magnates who supported the royal power against its domestic and foreign enemies was definitely closed. The increasing expenditure that war imposed upon the state, or the princes, compelled the latter to find some new means of replenishing their treasuries. For now that bands of mercenaries and fleets were playing a greater part in warfare, it was becoming more costly than ever. The old sources of revenue were insufficient. Consequently, the only thing to be done was to apply to the third estate, that is, to the cities, and to ask them to open their purses. The decline of the economic position of the Jews, produced by the capitalization of the economy, resulted in the loss of the protection that the kings and princes had accorded them. The kings became actively associated in the persecutions and pillaging of the Jews. B. The nobility and the Jews. In the High Middle Ages, the Jews were indispensable to the nobles as principal suppliers of Oriental products. Later on, the noble wastrel, living without foresight, needed the Jews as a financial reserve always ready to satisfy his caprices. For many a powerful lord the Jew was, as he was for the kings, an important source of revenue. In the epoch when royalty had not yet asserted its complete authority over the nobility, frequent conflicts broke out between princes, lords, and kings for possession of the Jews. In the 12th century, there was much talk about the suit between the Countess Blanche and King Philip II over the Jew Cresselin, who had fled from the domain of the Countess in order to take refuge in the lands of the king. After a manner of the kings, the barons appropriated the Jews. A baron would say, "My Jews," just as he said, "my lands," when he counted up his income. This property was, in fact, very remunerative. Thibaud, Count of Champagne, was as certain as King Philip of his property right over the Jews who lived in his domains. In 1198, the two concluded an agreement in which each promised not to detain the other's Jews. The practice of agreements on the subject of the Jews spreads rapidly in the 13th century. Instead of having to engage in long suits, the kings and princes agreed to surrender to each other the Jews who took refuge on their territories. Such an agreement, reached in 1230, states that the king as well as the princes preserve their rights in the Jews who are like slaves. Later on, we see Jews put on the auction block after a fashion. Philip IV buys all the Jews of the county of Valois from his brother, the Count of Valois, after having had a suit against him concerning 43 Jews whose property he claimed. He also buys from him a Jew of Rouen who was good for £300 quarterly. Whereas the prince-electors have the right within their domains to exploit all mines of gold, silver, tin, iron, as well as salt mines, therefore be it also granted them the right to admit and to possess Jews. This is the wording of a golden bull of the German emperor in the year 1356. The German cities, increasingly prospering, will soon dispute the right to possess Jews with the kings and princes. Just as between royalty and the princes, so also an agreement will be reached with the cities that will thus acquire an important share of the profits accruing from the exploitation of the Jews. It goes without saying that all those who thus profited from Jewish usury could only be hostile to the conversion of the Jews to Christianity. So true is it that religion is only a reflection of an economic function, that conversion to Christianity automatically led Jews to abandon their profession. The councils convoked by the new converts always led to violent conversions of a certain number of Jews, even if they did not win over the rabbis who participated in the discussions. This reached a point where the lords and the bishops themselves, whose Jews were thus being taken from them, and who were thus being deprived of the income they received from them, complained to the king on a number of occasions. The Bishop of Palencia, following a council convoked by a converted Jew, Jehuda Mosca, a council that had led to the conversion of a large number of Jews, prayed the king to come to his aid in view of the fact that his resources were going to be greatly reduced. The English king, William II, 1087 to 1100, who went so far as to farm out the collection of revenues in vacant bishoprics to Jews, compelled converted Jews to return to Judaism in order not to lose the profits he drew from them. In order to prevent the conversion of Jews, another English king, Henry II, decreed that the goods of Jews embracing Christianity would be seized by the crown to make up for the losses in revenues that the Jews would have brought the king if they had not been converted. By this, we can see the naivete of our idealist historians who imagined that all the efforts of Christianity were in the direction of converting the Jews, and who believe that all the sufferings of the Jews must be explained by the resistance they put up to these efforts. So long as the economic function represented by Judaism was necessary, there was opposition to their religious assimilation. It is solely when the Jews became superfluous economically that they had to assimilate or disappear. It was, of course, only a tiny part of the nobility that profited from Jewish usury. For the majority of feudal lords, the Jew was a direct cause of their ruin. For the king or the prince to be able to plunder the Jews, it was necessary that the majority of the nobles should groan under the weight of their debts. compelled thus to surrender to the Jews a portion of the surplus value they extorted from the peasants. It was obvious that the nobles would endeavor to retake it from them at the first opportunity. The indebtedness of the nobles to the Jewish usurers contained the germs of bloody conflicts. In 1189, there were anti-Jewish abuses in a number of English cities, in London, Lincoln, etc. A year later, the tragedy in York occurred. As mentioned earlier, knights indebted to the Yorkshire Jews, goaded on by a certain Malabis, attacked the Jews and the Scaccarium Judaeorum. The loan contracts found in the Scaccarium were solemnly burned, and the Jews who took refuge in the manor were besieged. The affair ended by a mass suicide of the Jews. The customary sequel was not lacking. The king took over the loan notes held by those who had committed suicide, since the Jews were the slaves of his treasury. The anti-Jewish massacres in London in 1264, which counted 550 victims, had also been organized by landed proprietors indebted to the Jews. The same was true of the anti-Jewish riots in other cities. Thus, in Canterbury, it began by an attack against the Scaccarium Judaeorum. All over Europe, assemblies of the nobility are unceasing in their protest against Jewish usury. Their various demands best characterize the position of the feudal lords relative to the Jews. In the second half of the 13th century, the Castilian Cortes submits the three following demands to the king. 1. Regulation of Jewish credit operations and limitations on the interest rates demanded by usurers. 2. Prescription of hereditary rights in the possession of lands by Jews. 3. A reform of the financial administration and elimination of Jewish functionaries and stewards. These will be the classical demands of the nobility in all the countries of Europe. They aim to limit the portion of surplus value that the nobility is compelled to turn over to the Jews, prevent them from becoming landed proprietors, and keep them from seizing control of the state apparatus. It was not until the 14th century that the Spanish nobility achieved its first results in this sphere. In 1328, King Alfonso IX reduced the rate of interest to 25% and cancelled 1/4 of all Jewish loans. In 1371, there was another cancellation of loans. The occasions were not few in which the Aragon Cortes raised protests against the high interest rate paid to the Jews, notably in 1235, 1241, 1283, 1292, and 1300. The Cortes of Portugal complains of Jewish usury in 1361 as becoming an increasingly unbearable yoke upon the population. In the circles of the Spanish nobility and rich patrician class, the Jews were hated because of their state functions, where they showed themselves to be servile instruments of royalty, as well as because of the great tax farming and revenue collections by which the Jewish magnates unceasingly augmented their fortunes. In Poland also, the demands of the nobility and the clergy against Jewish usury became more and more pressing. An ecclesiastical council, held in 1420, demanded measures by the king against great Jewish usury. In 1423, Władysław Jagiello decreed the Statute of Water, which forbade the Jews to lend on mortgages. In 1454, the statute of Niezawa limited the duration of Jewish loans to 3 years. The Sejms, assemblies of the nobility, succeeded in banning the Jews from access to state employment. The Polish nobility pursued the same objectives as the Spanish nobility: limitation of the interest rate, safeguarding of its properties, elimination of Jews from state employment. Political reasons join with economic causes for the hostility the nobility nurses against the Jews. In 1469, the Cortes protests against the admission of Jews to tax farming and against the protection with which the kings surround them. Ritual trials and massacres come to the support of the pressures exerted by the nobility upon royalty. The Jews were, in fact, solid supports of royal absolutism, which was above all directed against the nobility. The surplus value surrendered to the Jews by the nobles aided in forging their chains. The small barons hated the Jews as creditors. The great ones saw in them one of the principal financial resources on which the king's independence of them rested. The financial support furnished to the kings by the Jews was indispensable to them in their struggle against the nobility, as well as in their opposition to the growing demands of the cities. It was the Jews who first permitted the kings to maintain costly armies of mercenaries that begin to take the place of undisciplined hordes of the nobility. These armies first served foreign policy. Thus, in Spain, it was in large part Jewish finance that allowed the kings to defeat the Arabs. In 1263, the Jewish banker Judah de la Cavalleria lends the king of Aragon a great sum that permits him to equip a flotilla against the Arabs. In 1276, Cavalleria amasses funds for an army that fights the Arabs at Valencia. But what is more serious in the eyes of the nobility, and augments the list of its grievances, is the support that the Jews furnish royalty in the struggle it is conducting against the feudal lords. We have already spoken of the Ravia brothers, who supplied the royal army with money and arms during the domestic wars the king conducted against the insurgent nobles of Catalonia. The nobility could not forgive the Jews for that. The Ravia brothers fell victims of assassins, as did so many of their successors. Generally speaking, the struggle of the nobility against the Jews was far less radical than that of the bourgeoisie. Different social contents influenced the intensity and forms of struggle of each class. Whereas the landed proprietor still had need of the usurer and sought simply to limit the field of his activity, the bourgeois, and even the bourgeoisified noble, resented him more and more as an intolerable barrier. C. The bourgeoisie and the Jews. The commercial monopoly of the Jews was one of the greatest obstacles that the nascent bourgeoisie had to surmount. Destruction of the commercial domination of the Jews was the precondition for its own development. It was not a question of a struggle between two national or religious groups for commercial supremacy, but a conflict between two classes, each representing a different economic system. The apparent national competition is only a reflection here of the transition from feudal economy to exchange economy. The Jews ruled commerce in the epoch when the great proprietors bought works of refinement and objects of luxury of great price in exchange for large quantities of raw materials from their lands. The industrial development of Western Europe put an end to their monopoly. In struggling against the Jews, the native traders were rising up against an outmoded economic function, which appeared more and more as an intolerable exploitation of the country by foreigners. The relations of the merchant class with the Jews after the eviction of the latter from commerce underwent a profound modification. Jewish credit was essentially consumer credit. Merchants did not go to Jewish bankers to conduct their business affairs. Great banking houses like the Medicis, the Chigis, and the Fuggers developed in the great cities. Later, when exchange economy will have penetrated into the rural domains, the Jewish usurers will be crowded out by these great invading Christian banks. Just like pre-capitalist commerce, which exchange economy drives out of the cities, the usurer is dislodged by the penetration of capitalism into the feudal domain. Altogether different will be the position of the great merchants toward the Jews when the latter, upon the decline of their economic role, will no longer be anything but petty usurers lending to artisans and small shopkeepers. The Jew no longer operates in that period as a competitor of the rich trader or banker. He concerns them insofar as he is an attractive source of profit, and insofar as he is a means for weakening the popular classes with whom he is engaged in continuous struggle. The great merchants will now dispute with the kings and lords for the Jews. It is above all in Germany that the cities pass over to a general offensive to take possession of the profits the Jewish tax procured for the princes. From the second half of the 13th century on, the Jewish tax is increasingly divided up. The German cities, already flourishing in this period, begin to demand a share of it as well. Their determined struggle against the feudal lords conquered a series of liberties such as independent courts and the right of administration. They now turn their attention to the Jewish tax. They strive to tear it out of the hands of the lords and of the emperor. The city of Cologne, in 1252, secures from its archbishop the right to a third of the taxes collected from the Jews in the city. The Bishop of Worms, in 1293, allows the city council to admit and to tax Jews. On March the 7th, 1456, the Bishop Burchard leases the Jews of Halberstadt for 3 years to the council of this city. The tax from the Jews is taken over by Mainz, 1259, Regensburg, end of the 13th century, Nuremberg, 1315, Speyer, 1315, Zurich, 1335, Zurich, Frankfurt, 1337, Strasbourg, 1338, etc. The struggle of these three forces in a compromise upon the backs of the Jews. They will pay to the emperor a normal tax. In 1240, the Jews paid 1/5, a gold pfennig that every Jew or Jewess possessing more than 20 gulden had to pay. To the nobility, an annual tax and an extraordinary tax, and to the cities, a special tax, the amount of which is set for each Jew when he receives his letter of citizenship. Numerous taxes and extraordinary fees were added to those listed above. Methods similar to those we have encountered in other European countries were employed to extort as much money from the Jews as possible. Popular and peasant riots were similarly unique occasions for getting lush payments from the Jews for the protection granted them. The growth of the power of the cities increased their power over the Jews. In 1352, according to an authorization granted by the emperor to the city of Speyer, the Jews inhabiting our city will belong to us exclusively, will be our property in body and goods. An agreement of 1352 stipulates that the city of Frankfurt must pay the emperor half of the profits that it collects from the Jews. In Nuremberg, the emperor's share rose as high as 2/3. The class struggle, having as its object the division of the profits derived from the exploitation of the Jews, often turned against the latter. The Bishop of Cologne, states a chronicle of this city, wished to have a perpetual monopoly of the profits from the Jewish tax. That is why the Jews were driven out of this city forever. The Jews of the emperors were badly treated by the princes, those of the princes by the bourgeoisie. D. Relations of the Jews with the artisans and peasants. To the degree that usury became the principal occupation of the Jews, they entered increasingly into relations with the popular masses, and these relations worsened all the time. It was not luxury needs, but the distress that forced the peasant or the artisan to borrow from the Jewish usurer. They pawned their working tools, which were often indispensable to assure their livelihood. It is easy to understand the hatred that the man of the people must have felt for the Jew. He saw him as the direct cause of his ruin, without perceiving the emperor, the prince, or the rich bourgeois, who all became richer thanks to the Jewish usurer. It is in Germany, above all, where Jewish usury took on its most popular form, principally in the 14th and 15th centuries, that the hatred of the Jews manifested itself most, hatred that ended in anti-Jewish massacres and in the burning of Jews. Many pogroms against the Jews in the late Middle Ages, the purpose of which was primarily to destroy the promissory notes held by them, must be understood as a credit crisis of the most barbaric kind, as a medieval form of what is today called a social revolution. The first large-scale riots against the Jews took place between 1336 and 1338. They were led by the tavern keeper Cymbeline, the king of the poor, and from Alsace they spread into Bavaria, Austria, and Bohemia. But it was above all during the years of the Black Death between 1348 and 1350 that fanaticism joined with hatred and made terrifying ravages. In Strasbourg, it was the guilds that preached annihilation of the Jews, but the city council, with its patrician majority that drew large profits from usury, refused to give its consent. Representatives of the bourgeoisie, such as Conrad von Winterborg, the rich Sturm, and the wealthy artisan Schwaber, made speeches in favor of the Jews. Nevertheless, the guilds do not abandon their anti-Jewish demands. The matter was finally left to a congress that was to meet in 1343, and in which representatives of the church, the nobility, and the cities were to take part. The demands of the guilds are supported by the church and by the lords, who are anxious to rid themselves of their debts. Following this, the Jews were declared outside the pale of the law, and the burning of Jews spread throughout Alsace. In Mainz and Cologne, the patricians tried to protect the Jews, but were overwhelmed by the popular wave. A city chronicle of Augsburg relates the following. In 1384, the bourgeois of Nedlingen, having massacred all the Jews of Nedlingen, took possession of their goods. The debtors of the Jews, among them the Count of Ettingen, were freed of their debts. The pledges and lending notes of the Count were returned to him. All this was done by the mob, against the will of the city council. The peasant revolts were accompanied by massacres of Jews. In 1431, the armed peasants of the Pfalz marched against Worms and demanded that the city council hand over the Jews to them in view of the fact that they had ruined them and stripped them down to their last shirts. The council opposed these demands, since its members were the ones who profited most from Jewish usury. The lords entered into negotiations with the council in order to obtain the cancellation of accumulated interest-bearing down upon the impoverished peasants. The anti-Jewish riots in Catalonia and in the Balearic Islands bear the same character. The peasants, living in great poverty and heavily indebted to the Jews because of the burden of taxes, revolt in order to free themselves from their debts. They burn the judicial archives. And that's it. That's all of chapter 3 read. So that will be all for tonight. I will, of course, be back on on next Tuesday to continue reading Vladimir Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Next Thursday, I'll be beginning Mila's Story in Freedom Planet for the gaming stream. And next Saturday, I will begin reading Chapter 4, The Jews in Europe up to the 19th Century. So that is going to be it for tonight's stream. So if you enjoy the streams, or if you're watching later, subscribe, like the stream if you like it. I'll be putting all the stream archives into a playlist so that if you're here later down the line or you want to come back to it, the archives will be there. But until then, I will see you guys next time.